I'm Juliet Johnson, 28 years old, and the night my parents disowned me, my father pointed at the front door like I had already been erased from the family. "If you walk out with that ring on your finger," he shouted, "don't expect a dime of inheritance or the trust fund." My mother stared at me with that cold smile she used at charity galas and board dinners, then said, "You're throwing away everything for a man with no status, no future, and no place in this family." A second later, her mask slipped. "You're marrying a broke nobody." That was the moment I realized their anger wasn't just anger. It was fear. My parents had built a powerful tech company from nothing, and somewhere along the way, money stopped being security and became religion. They didn't just want me to be successful. They wanted me to be useful to the legacy. They didn't come to my wedding. My brother stood by and said nothing, which somehow felt worse. I married the man they mocked. And when I walked down the aisle without my family, my husband leaned in and whispered, "We don't need any of it." 3 months later, the same people who called him a nobody were no longer talking about standards, reputation, or family values. They were panicking, because the man they dismissed at my wedding was never who they thought he was. And when they finally learned the truth, they didn't call to congratulate me. They called because they needed him. Before I tell you what happened after they came back, and what he said when they realized they had picked the wrong person to look down on, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story travels. My wedding day should have been one of the happiest days of my life. But from the moment I woke up, it felt like I was walking into a ceremony with a missing organ. I had spent years being shaped by my parents' world. Private schools, curated internships, approved friendships, polished expectations. So even though I had chosen Ryan with my whole heart, part of me still kept glancing toward the door, as if love could somehow override humiliation and make my family appear at the last minute. They didn't. No message, no flowers, no excuse, not even the courtesy of pretending traffic had delayed them. Their silence was deliberate. Ryan and I weren't having the kind of wedding my parents would have hosted. It was smaller, warmer, and real, with close friends, a few professors of Ryan's, and people who actually cared about us instead of our last name. That alone would have offended them. But the bigger insult in their minds was that I was marrying a man they couldn't classify. Ryan Carter didn't brag, didn't chase attention, and didn't explain himself unless he felt it mattered. He had a calmness that irritated powerful people because it made their intimidation look childish. That was one of the first things I loved about him. He made me feel seen outside the architecture of image. When I stepped into the aisle, I focused only on him, because if I let myself look too hard at the empty places where my parents should have been, I knew grief would take over. Ryan looked at me like nothing else in the room mattered, and for a few minutes that was enough. Then I noticed my older brother, David, standing near the back. He had an RSVPD, and he wasn't there to support me. He stood with his shoulders tight and his jaw locked, like he was attending the scene of a bad investment. David had spent his life becoming the son my father wanted: disciplined, obedient, polished, useful. He understood my parents better than I did because he had never seriously tried to escape them. During the ceremony, he said nothing, but halfway through, when everyone was focused on the vows, I heard him mutter, "This is a mistake." Not loud enough to cause a scene, just venomous enough to bruise the moment. I kept going anyway. I married Ryan. I chose him in front of God, our friends, and the version of my old life that was dying in real time. Afterward, while guests were trying to keep the mood light, David cornered me near the terrace and asked if I was still willing to fix this before it became permanent damage. I laughed in disbelief. I just got married. He lowered his voice and said my parents were humiliated, that board members were asking questions, that people were talking, that my choice reflected badly on the family. It was almost funny how quickly the real issue surfaced. Not my happiness. Not whether Ryan loved me, their image, their investors, their narrative. I told him I was done living inside a family brand disguised as concern. He looked over at Ryan and said, "Men like him never lasted in our world." I told him maybe that was because our world was broken. Ryan found me later outside, wrapped his coat around my shoulders, and asked what David had said. When I told him, he didn't look offended. He looked thoughtful, almost like he was filing something away. Then he said, "The hardest part is happening now. Not forever. Just now." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I held on to it. That night, after the dancing and the goodbyes and the effort of smiling through a wound, we sat together in the back of a car with city lights sliding across the window. And I asked him if he ever wished he'd fallen in love with someone whose family wasn't a full-scale disaster. He smiled and said, "Emma, you're not the disaster. You're the person they tried to package." Then he kissed my hand and added, "They should be more careful about underestimating strangers." At the time, I thought he was just reassuring me. Later, I realized it was a warning. Marriage began in a small one-bedroom apartment that my mother would have called embarrassing, and my father would have called proof that I'd thrown my life away. To me, it felt raw, but honest. There were no assistants, no family accounts, no invisible safety net hiding behind my last name. There was rent, grocery lists, job applications, secondhand furniture, and the quiet shock of discovering how much of my old life had been engineered to prevent me from ever feeling financially vulnerable. At first, I was almost proud of the struggle. Every cheap plate, every mismatched chair, every long evening at our kitchen table felt like proof that I had finally chosen a real life over a curated one. Ryan made it easier because he never acted ashamed of our circumstances. He treated our little apartment like it was the beginning of something, not the aftermath of a fall. But reality has a way of exhausting even noble choices. I had the education, the resume, the references, and the polished background that should have made job hunting manageable. Yet rejection followed me with suspicious consistency. Companies that sounded excited during early conversations suddenly withdrew. A promising interview would cool the moment my last name came up. One recruiter I knew well finally admitted what I had already begun to suspect. People were hearing things. There was a quiet story circulating that I was unstable, reckless, and out of touch because I had made some emotional personal decision that severed me from my family. It didn't take a genius to guess where that narrative came from. My parents didn't need to publicly attack me. They just had to frame me as a liability and let Boston's elite professional ecosystem do the rest. When I told Ryan, he wasn't surprised enough for my comfort. He said he had suspected they might do something like that. That answer bothered me, but not enough to force the deeper questions I should have asked. We were too busy surviving. Bills became harder to discuss. Every trip to the grocery store became math. I stopped meeting people because pity mixed with curiosity is one of the ugliest social expressions in the world. Friends drifted. A few people who once loved being seen with me suddenly became hard to reach. I heard rumors about Ryan, too, that he was a student, a failed founder, a drifter. Some broke intellectual with too much confidence and not enough backing. The most humiliating part was how eagerly people believed my family's version of events. One afternoon, in a moment of weakness, I called David. I don't know if I wanted comfort, honesty, or just proof that someone in my family still saw me as human. He answered like I was interrupting him. The conversation went badly almost immediately. He mocked my decision, questioned how love planned to pay rent, and made it painfully clear that he needed me to fail. That was the moment I saw him clearly. His loyalty to our parents wasn't just love or habit, it was identity. If I could walk away from the family machine and still be okay, then he had to face what he had surrendered to remain inside it. When I asked what his real problem with Ryan was, he dodged it badly enough to confirm that Ryan was absolutely the issue. I hung up furious and shaken. That night, Ryan listened while I repeated every cruel word David had said. Then he looked at me and said, "He sounds threatened." I said he sounded smug. Ryan said smugness was just how threatened people dressed themselves when they wanted to feel in control. I remember staring at him then, realizing again that he seemed to understand my family's psychology with unusual precision. He kept saying things that sounded less like comfort and more like observation. He spoke about control, panic, and power as if he had seen this kind of collapse before. Around that same time, I began noticing little contradictions I kept pushing aside. Ryan had calls he took in private. He spoke about markets, company structures, and technical risk with a fluency that didn't fit the broke nobody version my parents had assigned him. He stayed calm in situations where most people would have been humiliated or defensive. Still, none of that felt big enough to challenge head-on because I was too tired. The lowest point came after another failed interview when I got home soaked from the rain, sat on the floor in the entryway, and cried so hard I couldn't even take off my shoes. Ryan found me there, knelt in front of me, and let me collapse without trying to fix it too quickly. I told him I was scared my parents had been right, that maybe I had confused bravery with stupidity. He held my face, looked straight at me, and said, "Hard doesn't mean wrong, and struggling doesn't mean small." Then he told me something that stayed with me the way his wedding night whisper had stayed with me. "Your parents think they're waiting for you to come back. Don't. There's another option. You just can't see it yet." That was the first time I seriously wondered whether Ryan wasn't just enduring the fallout with me. Maybe he was already studying how it would end. The next shift came from a place I never expected: my late grandmother's attorney. I got a call from a formal, careful woman named Margaret Levin, who informed me that my grandmother had created a private trust in my name years earlier, separate from the more visible financial structures my father always used as leverage. I met Margaret in her office 2 days later and learned something that changed the emotional landscape instantly. My grandmother had apparently known my parents were too obsessed with control, and she had set aside money specifically tied to my marriage and long-term independence. The language in the trust was so precise, it felt like a message from beyond the grave: personal stability, autonomous decision-making, independent security. My grandmother had seen the family machine more clearly than I ever had. The money would help enormously, but there was a complication. Accessing the trust would trigger legal and procedural notices that my parents would almost certainly become aware of, and Margaret warned me that while they could not stop the distribution outright, they might try to create pressure around it. She was right. Within days, my mother called in that polished, careful voice she used when pretending concern while negotiating advantage. She asked about the attorney, the trust, my plans, and whether I was prepared to manage something so important without family guidance. I asked if she meant guidance or control. She did not enjoy that. As always, she tried to turn my clarity into emotional instability, implying I was too upset to think clearly, too inexperienced to understand consequences, too vulnerable to manage money outside the protective structure of the family. I told her the family had never protected me. It had curated me. That landed harder than she expected. Behind all her careful phrasing, the real concern emerged quickly: optics, perception, family interests, investor sensitivity. Even now, after they had skipped my wedding and helped poison my professional reputation, their first instinct was to regain control over whatever resource might reduce my dependence on them. It was never about whether I was okay. It was about whether I remained governable. Around the same time, other strange contacts began appearing. Family friends suddenly checking in, former colleagues reaching out with suspicious warmth, people my mother clearly hoped could act as soft pressure points. They were collecting information, testing my financial weakness, looking for a way back in. Ryan watched it all with unsettling calm. One evening, after another disappointing update in my job search, I finally turned to him and said, "How do you know exactly how these people think?" This time I didn't say it casually. He paused, then admitted he had dealt with people like my parents at a level I didn't yet understand. That answer would have frustrated me under other circumstances, but instead it sharpened something in me. Then he asked a different question. If he told me there was a way to build something real without touching my family's money or approval, would I take the risk? I said yes before even knowing what he meant. That was when he began telling me about a company idea he had been quietly developing, an enterprise security and infrastructure venture designed around weaknesses that fast-growing tech companies often ignored until it was too late. At first, the technical details went over my head, but the bigger picture didn't. Ryan wasn't fantasizing. He had a real model, a real product direction, a real understanding of market gaps, and most importantly, a real sense of how companies like my parents overestimated branding and underestimated structural weakness. We started working on the idea at night in our apartment, me shaping language and narrative, him refining architecture and strategy. It was the first time in months that I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with pleasing my family. The marriage that had been under siege started becoming a partnership in the deepest sense. We weren't just trying to survive rejection anymore. We were building. Meanwhile, my mother's messages kept arriving in softer language, trying to frame reconciliation as maturity and caution as love. I deleted most of them. Then Ryan told me he had secured a meeting with real investors. Not vague maybes. Real people. Serious people. People my parents would care about if they knew. When I asked how serious, he said, "Serious enough that if this goes well, your parents will hear about it whether we tell them or not." For the first time since my wedding, I felt something cleaner than hope. I felt anticipation. Once the investor meeting was scheduled, our apartment stopped feeling like a place where we were barely holding things together and started feeling like a command center. We spent nights preparing decks, refining language, rehearsing answers, and arguing over tone, risk, market framing, and the exact emotional balance between confidence and credibility. The more I worked with Ryan on the venture, the more obvious it became that what he had was much bigger than a side project. He understood companies the way some people understand weather patterns, where the pressure sat, where cracks formed, where arrogance disguised fragility. He spoke about infrastructure, cyber risk, scaling errors, enterprise blind spots, and executive behavior with a level of fluency that forced me to confront a question I had postponed for too long. One night, after hours of revising the presentation, I finally closed my laptop and told him I needed the truth, not hints, not fragments, the full truth. He didn't act offended or cornered. He just nodded and told me Ryan had not grown up broke. His father had founded a respected infrastructure and cybersecurity firm that later became part of a larger technology group. After his father died, Ryan inherited equity interests and access he rarely discussed because he hated how people behaved around money and status. He had spent years keeping a deliberately low profile, choosing to study, consult, and build on his own terms rather than trading on his name. He wanted to know what people thought of his ideas before they knew what his background could do for them. When he met me, he chose not to lead with any of it because he didn't want my feelings, or my parents' judgment, to be filtered through his value on paper. I sat there stunned, but what I felt first wasn't anger, it was relief. Not because he had money, but because the strange calm he had shown all along finally made sense. He wasn't detached from risk. He had simply been navigating from a map I couldn't yet see. I asked why he hadn't told me sooner, especially when I was drowning under my family's cruelty. He said if he had revealed everything at the beginning, my parents would have instantly rewritten the narrative. Suddenly, the marriage would have been acceptable because he met their standards, and my decision would have been retroactively validated by wealth instead of by love. He said he needed the truth exposed cleanly. He needed to know that I chose him before anyone could decorate that choice with approval. It was frustrating, but it was also hard to argue with. From that moment on, I worked differently. I stopped feeling like the woman who had thrown away security for love and started feeling like a woman standing at the threshold of a major reversal. My family had dismissed Ryan because they took one look at the surface and decided they understood the whole man. That kind of arrogance is expensive when it meets someone patient enough not to correct it too soon. As the days went on, my family's anxiety started showing through small cracks. David texted me asking if we could have a mature conversation. My mother suddenly wanted to reconnect. My father stayed silent, which in his case was usually a sign he was gathering information and looking for leverage. Then David finally intercepted me outside a cafe and tried to warn me that my husband had been making calls, that my father knew there was some kind of meeting coming, and that if we were trying to build something near my parents' company, it would become a problem. That conversation gave away more than he intended. He was rattled. He wasn't mocking me anymore. He was afraid of exposure. When I got home and told Ryan what David had said, Ryan's only response was, "Good. That means they're starting to understand there's something they failed to measure." That night, lying beside him, I asked whether he had known from the beginning that my family and his professional world might eventually collide. He admitted he had recognized the overlap, but he also said he never pursued me because of it. He stayed because I made him want a life bigger than strategy. That answer mattered because it reminded me that even with all the power shifting underneath us, the center of the story was still personal. The next day, we walked into the investor meeting not as two people begging for rescue, but as partners carrying something real. The investor meeting took place in a sleek downtown space full of glass walls, quiet money, and the kind of controlled casualness rich people use when they want power to seem modern. I was nervous, but not because I doubted Ryan. I was nervous because I understood that if the room reacted the way I thought it might, what happened there would ripple outward fast. Ryan, on the other hand, looked completely at home. He greeted people as peers, not gatekeepers. That alone told me more than half his confession had. A former CTO greeted him warmly. An investor I recognized from business publications used his first name with obvious familiarity. Another woman mentioned reading something he had written and spoke to him with real respect. Watching that, I realized how badly my parents had misread him. They hadn't just underestimated a man, they had exposed the laziness of their own judgment. Ryan and I started setting up, going over the flow one last time, when the door opened and David walked in. He did not belong there, and the tension in his face said he knew it. He came straight toward us and demanded to speak to me outside. I refused. He lowered his voice and said I had no idea how much damage this could cause. Ryan stepped closer and told him this was neither the place nor the time. David turned on him and accused him of lying. Ryan answered with calm precision. My family had made assumptions, and assumptions were not the same thing as truth. That shut David up long enough for the meeting to begin. Ryan led the first half of the pitch and was extraordinary. He wasn't flashy, which made him even more persuasive. He laid out the market problem, the structural weaknesses in existing enterprise systems, the cost of false confidence, and the opening for a solution that addressed not just technology, but executive denial. I recognized my parents' company in half the examples without him ever naming them. When my turn came, I stepped into the positioning and narrative sections and felt a version of myself return that I had missed. I knew how to translate intelligence into urgency. I knew how to talk about trust, risk, brand fragility, and the gap between companies that looked resilient and companies that were resilient. No one in that room looked at me like a reckless daughter cut loose from a powerful family. They looked at me like I belonged. That alone felt like revenge. Then came the turning point. One of the senior investors asked Ryan to clarify his background and affiliations for the room because some details suggested prior connections that might matter. Ryan didn't hesitate. He gave them the truth clearly and without showmanship. His father's firm, his equity positions, his technical work, his advisory history, the networks he had intentionally kept out of public branding while deciding what he wanted to build independently. The room recalibrated in real time. Not with melodrama, serious people don't gasp, but with the quiet shift that happens when respect deepens instantly. I looked at David and saw the moment the full weight of his family's mistake hit him. They had dismissed Ryan as a nameless nobody and now had to confront that the room they feared most already knew exactly who he was. Follow-up questions turned into serious interest. Concrete next steps were mentioned. It was no longer a hopeful conversation. It was a live opportunity. As the meeting ended, David came at us again, accusing Ryan of setting my family up to underestimate him. Ryan answered that he hadn't set them up. He had simply never interrupted their arrogance. That line landed like a verdict. Then my phone buzzed. It was my mother. "We need to talk. Now." I stared at the message and understood something essential. For the first time since disowning me, she was not reaching out from authority. She was reaching out from exposure. On the ride home, I replayed everything and felt anger, relief, validation, and grief all tangled together. None of this had needed to happen. My parents could have chosen love over control months ago. They didn't. When I finally called my mother back, she asked why I hadn't told them who Ryan really was. I told her they never asked who he was. They decided what he was. She tried to frame everything as concern, said there were implications I didn't understand, said my father wanted to speak to him, said we all needed to sit down calmly. I heard the translation immediately. This morning he had been a mistake. Now he was an opportunity. When I ended the call, Ryan asked how bad it was. I looked at him and said, "Bad enough that now they need you." For the first time that day, I saw his expression harden. The next 48 hours were almost surreal because my parents changed roles so quickly. The people who had condemned, isolated, and disowned me were suddenly trying to re-enter the story as concerned realists seeking alignment. My father called Ryan directly the next morning, and Ryan put the phone on speaker so I could hear every word. My father opened like a man pretending this was a professional inconvenience instead of a personal reversal. He said it would be wise for them to meet because there were now overlapping business interests that could become unnecessarily adversarial. Translation: We realize you have power, and we want to control the damage. Ryan asked why avoiding adversarial outcomes was his responsibility. My father replied that he had married into the family. The audacity of that almost took my breath away. He had disowned me for marrying Ryan, and now he was invoking family when it served him. I jumped in and reminded him of that fact. He tried to smooth it over by saying people had said things in the heat of emotion, but that only made me angrier because it was a lie. They hadn't misspoken. They had revealed themselves. My father eventually got to the real point. He had heard Ryan's venture might be approaching firms connected to his company's interests, and he believed coordination would be wise. Ryan called it what it was: damage control. My father didn't deny it. Later that day, my mother asked to meet privately. I agreed, partly because I wanted to see their faces now that the narrative had turned, and partly because I knew something in me needed that confrontation to close. Ryan and I drove to my parents' house the next evening. Everything about the place looked the same: gates, symmetry, polished interiors, silent staff. But it no longer felt imposing. It felt like a stage set built to maintain the illusion that control was natural. My mother greeted us with brittle composure. My father was waiting in the sitting room, and David was there too, looking like a man who no longer knew where to stand. They tried to begin formally, as if this were an adult conversation among serious people, rather than the emotional wreckage of their own actions. My father said they had not been fully informed about Ryan's background. Ryan answered that they had been fully informed about their own behavior. My mother asked that we not make the evening hostile. I reminded her that hostile had been disowning me over my marriage. She then tried the softer route, saying they had only been afraid for me. That was when I finally said aloud what I had understood for years but never confronted directly. My parents weren't just angry because I married someone they thought was beneath the family. They were terrified because they had built their entire identity around escaping scarcity. And over time, survival had turned into obsession. They no longer judged people by kindness, character, or integrity. They judged by strategic value. I had refused to use marriage as an instrument of preservation, and that exposed something in them they did not want to face. My father told me I didn't get to psychoanalyze the family. I told him I had grown up in it. Then the conversation shifted where they really wanted it all along: business. My father spoke vaguely about mutual advantage, overlapping interests, and the need to avoid unnecessary market conflict. Ryan made him be clearer, and eventually the truth emerged. My parents' company had vulnerabilities, contracts in motion, and reasons to fear a competitor with better tools and stronger credibility entering adjacent space. They weren't asking for peace because they regretted what they had done to me. They were asking because for the first time in years, their control had limits. My mother then made the mistake of appealing to me by saying I had to understand what this could do to my father. That broke something final in me. Even then, even with all the damage they had caused, her instinct was not to ask what their choices had done to me. It was to ask me to help manage the consequences for him. I told her that if I was still their daughter, they should have acted like it when the cost was real. David finally admitted that none of them thought it would go this far, and I told him that was because they never expected their choices to circle back. When my father raised his voice, Ryan shut it down with one calm sentence, and I watched something happen that I think hurt my father more than any public embarrassment ever could. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, his anger no longer controlled the room. By the end of the meeting, my mother said they could make this right. I told her they could make themselves more comfortable, which was not the same thing. Ryan then drew the final line. He said he would not discuss business alignment in that room, and if they genuinely wanted any relationship repair with me, it would have to begin with honesty rather than leverage. We left them there. In the weeks that followed, consequences unfolded exactly as Ryan had predicted. My parents' company didn't collapse, but it lost narrative control. Investors and partners started asking sharper questions. Contracts slowed. Reviews began. The image of invulnerability cracked. Not because Ryan launched some personal vendetta, but because reality finally caught up with a company too accustomed to being protected by image. As for us, one investor group moved decisively, and our company began taking shape for real. My role became formal. I wasn't just Ryan's wife anymore. I was his partner in building something that had not been inherited or approved but earned. My mother kept sending messages trying to reframe the future as healing. My father sent one cold, careful email that came closest to apology without ever fully becoming one. David, to his credit, later admitted that part of his anger had come from the fact that if I could leave and still be okay, then he had to ask himself what he had stayed for. That was the first honest thing he had ever said to me. The sweetest part of the story was never watching my parents panic when they learned who my husband really was. The sweetest part was realizing I no longer needed their approval to know I had chosen well. Their panic was just the mirror turning. The real victory was that by the time they needed him, I no longer needed them to validate my life. At Revenge Argon, our team works hard to create meaningful, well-crafted stories that are both engaging and thought-provoking. We are committed to making it clear that these are fictional stories, created to share valuable lessons, positive messages, and educational insights with our viewers. The villains in this story weren't just cruel, they were blinded by pride, control, and the belief that money gave them the right to judge everyone else. In the end, their biggest downfall was underestimating the very people they tried to tear down. If you were in Emma's place, how would you deal with people like that? Would you walk away quietly, confront them directly, or make them regret every word?